Washington, D.C. is one of the most expensive cities in America. And if you look at all the business suits walking between K Street and Capitol Hill, you'd think that the city is practically recession-proof, which might have something to do with the high concentration of lobbyists and billions of lobby dollars that are peddled through the city every year. However, according to the watchdog website opensecrets.org, for the third year in a row, overall spending on lobbying has actually decreased to $3.2 billion, along with the official number of registered lobbyists to just over 12,000. Congressional lobbying experts, however, argue that lobbying isn't decreasing at all, and instead it's simply going underground. Well, earlier I spoke to investigative journalist for The Nation, Lee Fang, who just published an article called "Where Have All the Lobbyists Gone?" In it, he takes a closer look at what's been coined the shadow lobbying complex. I first asked him why the numbers posed on Open Secrets don't reveal the full story.
Well, the numbers that you are seeing on Open Secrets, which is a fantastic website, reflect the official lobbying registration system that's maintained by the House and Senate. The problem is the statute, the Lobbying Disclosure Act, is riddled with loopholes. There are many ways for lobbyists to evade the law, and simply put, there aren't many incentives for lobbyists to register, and the law does not cover all lobbying activity. So the real figure on how many lobbyists are in D.C. that are actively attempting to influence policy is closer to 100,000, not 12,000. And experts say the amount spent is not $3 billion, but closer to maybe 6, 9, or even 10 billion.
Unbelievable. And you're talking about all these loopholes under the Lobbying Disclosure Act, named after former Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle. Why is he the face of unregistered lobbyists?
Well, Senator Tom Daschle left the Senate, joined a private equity firm, also joined a law and lobbying firm, Alston & Bird. He's now at another one called DLA Piper. He's become the face of the problem because everyone knows that Tom Daschle lobbies, that he meets with government officials, that he meets with President Obama, that he coordinates meetings with legislators, with policy folks and businesses from healthcare and energy to other sectors. And he does this openly, and at the same time, he does not register. So given his prominence in Washington, D.C., helping President Obama with his healthcare overhaul, associated with many different think tanks and constantly in the news and at different functions in the city, he does all of this while flouting the law.
One of the most damning things about the article was Daschle's connection to the plan to have retailers like Gap skirt around responsibility for the Bangladesh garment factory collapse that killed more than 1,000 people. Lee, I was wondering if you could elaborate on that connection.
Sure. Well, we go through many different anecdotes, but this is one of the more tragic ones of how unregistered lobbyists peddle influence, and the public and the press is completely kept in the dark about who the real paymasters are. So for this example, if you look in the last summer, when in the aftermath of the latest major building collapse in Bangladesh, many European retailers offered a very strong plan to increase building inspections, to make sure that garment manufacturers or the retailers that pay the garment manufacturers are liable for these types of disasters. Well, American companies like Gap and Walmart and JCPenney did not like any of these reforms. They wanted to counter them. They didn't want to pay for any of these necessary upgrades or be liable for future disasters. So they had DLA Piper, Daschle's firm, go out and sell an alternative plan that does not keep them on the hook for any future liabilities, saving them a lot of money, but potentially causing more death and pain in the future. So what's interesting here is as DLA Piper lawyers and officials went around the city selling this alternative weak labor plan, no one knew that they were being paid by Gap, one of the big companies that refused to play ball. That's just another example of this shadow lobbying complex, that you have folks selling policy, selling influence, and affecting the way that these policies are enacted without registering and without disclosing. If you listen to their rhetoric when they were walking around the city selling this plan, they said that they're affiliated with think tanks, or they're simply former government officials. No one knew who was really behind this plan, simply because they didn't register.
And you give seriously dozens of examples here. I mean, this is just one of them that goes layers and layers and layers, as you're talking about right now. Lee, isn't there a way to investigate this? I mean, shouldn't the House Ethics Committee be overseeing the process of following up with those who are unregistered and still participating in lobbying?
That's a great question, and this was actually the most surprising part of reporting the story. I've covered lobbying and influence peddling for about 5 years now, and I did not know that the enforcement mechanism to the Lobbying Disclosure Act basically has no cop on the beat. There's never been a criminal enforcement case brought ever. There have been virtually no civil cases either, and that's because the only people overseeing this process of making sure people register and comply with the law, there's only one full-time employee at the Department of Justice. That's a contract paralegal who basically just processes the forms. Some other kind of file keepers in Congress also look into this, but if you simply don't register and you continue influence peddling, there's no enforcement mechanism to go after folks.
That's insane. That's absolutely insane. So I guess we know the answer for all the lobbyists. Just don't register. Lee, another thing in the article that you point out is the rebranding efforts on behalf of the lobbying industry. Can you give some examples of these and how renaming these institutions have changed their perceived role?
Right. I think if you look at public polling, Americans are incredibly upset about the role of big money in politics, the way lobbyists have taken control of the political process, have really taken control of both political parties. And to kind of combat this growing cynicism, whether from Occupy or the Tea Party, rather than changing their behavior or complying better with the law, lobbyists are instead simply changing their image, changing the names of their titles. So, for example, the American League of Lobbyists, a professional association for lobbyists, in November changed their name to the Government Affairs Associates, or Government Affairs Professionals. So that's a much more vanilla name. They take the L word out of it. They don't want to be called lobbyists. They call themselves other euphemisms like Public Affairs Associates or Government Affairs, Government Relations, that type of thing.
I wanted to point to just one think tank here in D.C., the Employment Policies Institute. Sounds very innocuous, a widely quoted economic research center pushing the notion that increasing the minimum wage would increase poverty. But it's backed by the National Restaurant Association. Lee, do you think that the polarization of issues in this country can be blamed on ideological front groups backed by massive lobbying efforts?
I think you hit the nail on the head there. A lot of the political debates we see on television, in the media, are not much more than political theater propped up by characters who are saying what they're saying or pushing a certain policy because someone's paying them, and you don't know who they are. They'll say, oh, this is to help the Democrats or to help the Republicans, but in many cases, they're pushing a very narrow corporate interest without revealing who their true paymasters are.
How much of legislation would you say is written by lobbyists? I remember doing an investigation into just California state legislature, and it was like, I think 60%. This is a couple of years ago. I was just wondering if you had any insight on the federal level here.
Well, California, for all of its flaws, and as you know, and I'm a recent transplant to the state, it's very corrupt, but at least you have a system of showing who sponsors bills in Sacramento. In Washington, and I just finished a reporting trip in Idaho, and the lobbyists actually wear name IDs. So there's a lot of problems in Idaho, but there's certain elements of transparency. In Congress, there are no such standards. Lobbyists write bills every day. They're sponsoring legislation, but there's no system to keep tabs on that.
Lee, you mentioned before, of course, Open Secret's an excellent website. Even they aren't tracking the dark money. It takes something like you and very in-depth investigation. How do we follow this? I mean, what do we do to follow this trend here?
That's a good question. Well, I just relaunched my, this is a self-plug, excuse me, but last week I relaunched my investigative blog, republicreport.org, and there are many reporters who are following the money trail, trying to uncover these types of stories. But I have to say, it's very difficult because so much of the system has been pushed into the darkness. It's purposefully secret. And in some cases, for this story that I reported yesterday, you only stumble into it. The opening anecdote to that story of finding former congressman lobbying for Palantir, I just overheard him bragging about it on Capitol Hill. You just stumble into it sometimes.
Yeah, that's what I love about it. You were very natural. You were there on Capitol Hill trying to figure out what was going on, and you saw firsthand kind of the shady wheelings and dealings of all these people. I was speaking to Jack Abramoff the other day, and he said that Citizens United didn't actually make it easier for lobbyists because they'll always find a way to get around it. What do you think, Lee? Do you think Citizens United exacerbated this problem?
Well, I'm of two minds on Citizens United and lobbyists. For one thing, it makes raising money for a politician easier. Instead of having to be on the phones for sometimes 8 hours a day for some of these politicians, begging people for these $3,000, $5,000 checks, you can just find one sponsor, someone who bring in a super PAC that can dump $1 million into your district. That makes it much easier. So it's kind of a counterintuitive take. At the same time, it makes corruption much worse because if a chemical industry lobbyist wants to pressure a senator or a congressman, all they have to do now is set up a front group and funnel corporate money into that front group, unlimited amounts of money, and it's very easy to pressure a lawmaker when the corruption is that simple.
Right, and the Koch brothers, of course, have mastered this. How do we stop this toxic cycle, Lee? Because, of course, in order to play the game, you got to have a lobby on the Hill now.
No, that's right. And, I've talked to a lot of campaign finance experts, folks who are interested in good government, and there's a consensus that we need better laws. And I don't disagree with that necessarily, but we also need enforcement. So there's no political will at the Department of Justice, and there's no resources devoted into investigating federal corruption. I think citizens need to demand that type of enforcement because there are laws on the books. They simply aren't being enforced. Thank you so much. Excellent work, Lee Fang, journalist, contributor at The Nation. Really appreciate your time. Thank you so much, Abby. Lobbying Disclosure Act, named after former Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle. Why is he the face of unregistered lobbyists? Well, Senator Tom Daschle left the Senate, joined a private equity firm, also joined a law and lobbying firm, Alston & Bird. He's now at another one called DLA Piper. He's become the face of many incentives for lobbyists to register, and the law does not cover all lobbying activity. So the real figure on how many lobbyists are in D.C. that are actively attempting to influence policy is closer to 100,000, not 12,000. And experts say the amount spent is not $3 billion, but closer to maybe 6, 9, or even 10 billion. Unbelievable. And you're talking about all these loopholes under the law registered lobbyists to just over 12,000. Congressional lobbying experts, however, argue that lobbying isn't decreasing at all, and instead it's simply going underground. Well, earlier I spoke to investigative journalist for The Nation, Lee Fang, who just published an article called "Where Have All the Lobbyists Gone?" In it, he takes a closer look at what's been coined the shadow lobbying complex. I first asked him why the numbers posed on Open Secrets don't reveal the full story. Well, the numbers that you are seeing on Open Secrets, which is a fantastic website, reflect the official lobbying registration system that's maintained by the House and Senate. The problem is the statute, the Lobbying Disclosure Act, is riddled with loopholes. There are many ways for lobbyists to evade the law, and simply put, Washington, D.C. is one of the most expensive cities in America. And if you look at all the business suits walking between K Street and Capitol Hill, you'd think that the city is practically recession-proof, which might have something to do with the high concentration of lobbyists and billions of lobby dollars that are peddled through the city every year. However, according to the watchdog website opensecrets.org, for the third year in a row, overall spending on lobbying has actually decreased to $3.2 billion, along with the official number of